It all started on a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind where the sky hangs low and heavy, pressing against the windows like it's eavesdropping on every word. She sat across from me on the couch, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line I had learned over months to read as final, immovable. Her voice was calm, almost detached, but underneath it all, I could feel the tremor of something dangerous lurking. "I need space," she said. "Don't contact me for a while." Those words hit me harder than I expected. I had anticipated arguments, maybe a fight, even a dramatic scene that would leave both of us exhausted and angry. But this was like being shoved off a cliff into a fog I couldn't see through. Space, don't contact me. A week, a month. Indefinitely. Her ambiguity was a weapon, and she wielded it effortlessly. I remember staring at her, trying to read her face for any hint of what space really meant. Her eyes, normally bright and teasing, were cold, unreadable. I wanted to ask questions, to argue, to cling to her logic, but something inside me told me to obey. Respect her wishes. Give her the distance, she demanded. That's what she wanted, right? The next morning, my phone began buzzing incessantly, not with messages from her, but from friends and social media alerts. And then I saw it. A string of posts that made my stomach twist. She was on a sun-soaked beach, a tropical paradise filled with crystal clear water and white sand, and she wasn't alone. Her ex-boyfriend was there, arms wrapped casually around her shoulders, both of them laughing like a memory had come alive in the present. I couldn't breathe at first. The betrayal was immediate, sharp, like a fist to the chest. I replayed her words in my head. I need space. Was this what space meant? Freedom to flaunt herself with someone else while I sat at home, respecting her wishes like a fool. Every rational part of me screamed, confront her. Demand answers. Make her see the hurt she's causing. But something deeper, a slower, more deliberate part, held me back. I realized that this wasn't just betrayal, it was a test. I spent hours scrolling through the photos, each one worse than the last. Sunlight glinted off their smiles, glinting like knives. She looked happy, untouchable, and me. I felt frozen, trapped between the shock of her actions and the bitter taste of helplessness. But as the minutes stretched into hours, a strange clarity settled over me. She wanted space. Fine. She was getting it, but not the kind she expected. The decision didn't come in a moment of rage. It came like a slow tide, inexorable and unrelenting. I began to plan, quietly, meticulously. If she wanted space, she would get it in a way that she could never have imagined. I started with the apartment, the very place where we had built our routines, our arguments, our quiet Sunday mornings and chaotic Friday nights where she had left her imprint on the walls and shelves. I called a locksmith, scheduled a change of locks for the same evening. Every key she had, gone. I smiled at the thought, imagining her returning, fumbling at the door, disbelief and confusion twisting her face. But I didn't stop there. The car she used daily, the one technically still in my name, became part of the plan. I contacted a buyer, sold it discreetly, ensuring she wouldn't have a trace of it left in her hands. Finally, her favorite parking space, the one she always claimed as hers, I cleared, empty, bare, silent. I kept my actions meticulous, almost ritualistic. Every step was calculated, every move deliberate. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense, it was about control. Reclaiming the space she had taken for granted and making her confront the reality of her choices. I imagined her walking back, keys in hand, ready to step back into a life she assumed was still hers. And she would find nothing. Days passed in a strange limbo. She continued posting, smiling with her ex, her carefree life documented for anyone to see. I watched silently, knowing that my plan was nearing its peak. The anticipation built in my chest, not as anger, but as a quiet, simmering satisfaction. She had demanded space, and soon she would get it in a way that words could never describe. The final preparation was the hardest. I had to pretend everything was normal when in reality I was dismantling the framework of her daily life. I moved silently, efficiently. The apartment felt strange without her presence, cold and alien, but I reminded myself this was temporary. This was for the lesson she needed to learn. I didn't revel in her absence. I respected it. I had simply transformed it into a power she never anticipated. Finally, the day came when I knew she would return. I imagined her steps approaching the door, confident, expectant. She would reach for the key, and the first shock would hit. The lock had changed. Confusion would follow, disbelief, then panic. I pictured her eyes scanning the apartment, taking in the absence of her car, the emptiness of her parking spot. My heart didn't race with malice. It beat with the quiet rhythm of inevitability. She had created the circumstances. I was merely responding with precision. That night, I sat on the couch where we had shared so many evenings, letting the memory of her words echo in my mind. I need space. Space, indeed. She would have it more than she had ever imagined, and it would force her to confront the consequences of her choices in the starkest, most undeniable way. The morning she returned was quiet, almost eerily so, like the world was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. I had finished my coffee, sat by the window, and watched the street for any sign of her car, any familiar figure approaching the building. But the street was empty, save for the occasional passerby. Blissfully unaware of the storm about to hit, when she finally appeared, the first thing I noticed was her confident, a smile playing on her lips as if she owned the world. She reached into her bag for the keys, expecting the familiar resistance of our old lock, but nothing was familiar anymore. The first twist of the key brought only cold metal sliding against metal that refused to yield. Her face shifted almost imperceptibly, confusion creeping in, followed by a flash of irritation. "Hey, why isn't this working?" she muttered, louder this time, her tone sharpened by growing frustration. She jiggled the keys, rattled the handle, and even tried the spare key hidden in some predictable corner. All in vain. The locks had changed, and every key she owned was useless. I stayed silent, letting the moment stretch, letting her realize that something fundamental had shifted. Her next move was immediate: the car. She scanned the street, eyes widening as she noticed the absence of her vehicle. The familiar space where it had sat, the place she had claimed as her own, was bare. Panic began to replace the earlier veneer of composure, and I felt the tension tighten like a wire in the room. She turned to me, her gaze sharp, demanding, questioning, and perhaps even pleading, though she didn't voice it. What did you do?" she finally said, voice trembling slightly as the words caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. I leaned back casually, letting the silence answer for me. I didn't rush to explain, didn't attempt to soften the edges of what had been done. There was no point. The reality of her choices had already set the stage, And now the consequences were unfolding like clockwork. I watched her move through the apartment, every step a calculated dance of anger and shock. She opened drawers, checked cabinets, her hands brushing against emptiness where her things should have been. Each gesture told me that she was beginning to comprehend the extent of what had changed. It wasn't just the locks, or the car, or the parking space. It was the statement. It made the undeniable truth that she had underestimated how seriously her words could be taken, and how thoroughly the consequences could manifest. Her breathing grew heavier, quickening in rhythm as frustration and fear collided. I could see her mind racing, replaying the past weeks, her vacation photos, the carefree moments she had shared with someone else while I had respected her wishes. She hadn't anticipated that my compliance would take this form. She hadn't anticipated that respecting her space could be a weapon, precise and unforgiving. I could almost hear her thoughts, unspoken yet palpable. How could this happen? Why would he do this? This isn't fair. But fairness had nothing to do with it. Her choices had consequences, and the responsibility rested squarely on her shoulders. Every attempt to argue, to justify, to place blame externally would falter because the truth was undeniable. She had asked for space, and she had received it in the most absolute, uncompromising sense. I remained calm, watching her navigate the emptiness she had created for herself. It was a strange, almost surreal experience, seeing someone confront the results of their own actions in such a tangible way. Her anger became palpable, radiating outward in sharp bursts. Yet I stayed composed, the eye in the storm. Steady and unmoved, she eventually collapsed onto the sofa, the same one where weeks before she had spoken casually about vacations, about work, about life. Now it felt different, heavy with tension. The air between us had transformed into a battleground of consequences and realization. She looked at me, her eyes wide, searching for answers, for justification, for a lifeline that I refused to offer. You changed everything. You can't just, she started, voice cracking slightly. But I cut her off with a single word, calm, deliberate. I did respect your wishes. The silence that followed was more deafening than any argument we had ever had. Her mind struggled to process the sequence of events, the locks, the car, the parking space, the apartment stripped of familiarity. Each piece was a carefully executed part of a whole, a narrative I had constructed not out of malice, but out of precision. She had demanded space, and I had provided it with meticulous attention to detail. She tried to argue, tried to reclaim some semblance of control, but I had already removed every foothold she could rely on. Her fury was almost cinematic in its intensity, hands gesturing wildly, voice rising, yet every expression, every word only reinforced the inevitability of what had occurred. She had created the scenario. I had merely mirrored it back with an unflinching mirror. Hours passed, and the intensity of her reactions began to wane, replaced by something more subdued resignation. She sat quietly, staring at the empty spaces, the absence of her possessions, the altered reality she had walked into. And in that quiet, I could see the lesson settling in, the understanding that respect, compliance, and boundaries could be wielded with as much precision as any weapon in the end. It wasn't about revenge in the shallow sense. It was about accountability. She had asked for space. I gave it. But I gave it fully, absolutely, in a way that left no room for ambiguity or denial. And now, facing the emptiness she had once taken for granted, She had no choice but to confront the truth of her actions. She stayed there for what felt like an eternity, sitting on the edge of the sofa, eyes darting around the apartment as if searching for some hidden explanation, some secret that could undo what had already been done. But there was nothing. Every corner was deliberate in its emptiness, every space a testament to choices made and the consequences they carried. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, spinning fast, trying to catch up with reality, trying to rewrite the narrative in a way that made sense to her. Her voice was low now, quieter, almost pleading. I don't understand. Why would you do this? She looked at me, searching for some trace of hesitation, some crack in my calm demeanor that might offer mercy or explanation. But I remained steady, letting her words fall into the heavy silence that filled the room. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, to understand that her demand for space wasn't just a casual statement. It was a boundary she had set without anticipating the full implications. You told me to give you space, I said, my tone even measured. I gave it to you. Fully, absolutely. The words hung between us, undeniable, impossible to refute. She opened her mouth to argue, to accuse, but no words could undo what had been done. She had chosen her path, and I had mirrored it with precision. The absence of her car outside, the altered locks, the cleared parking spot, it all became a stark tableau of reality she could no longer ignore. She had imagined space as freedom to flout boundaries, to flaunt her choices without consequence. But she had forgotten that respect and compliance could be just as absolute, just as uncompromising. She had underestimated the simplicity and inevitability of the logic I watched as frustration and disbelief slowly gave way to a dawning comprehension. Her ex-boyfriend's images, once gleaming and triumphant in her social media feed, now felt distant and hollow. The vacation, the sun-soaked smiles, all of it contrasted sharply with the cold, unyielding reality she faced now. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that her freedom had come at a cost, one she had not accounted for, one she had never imagined would be enforced with such clarity. Her anger returned briefly, sharper this time, but it lacked the raw energy of before. It was tinged with a helplessness that made it almost tragic. She gestured at the empty parking space outside, her voice trembling slightly. My car, it was still in your name, but why? Why would you do this? I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street she had once assumed belonged to her. Because you asked for space, I said simply. I gave it. I respected it. But respect can be absolute. Respect can have consequences. You wanted distance, and now you have it in every sense. She sank back onto the sofa, her energy spent, eyes fixed on the floor. The realization had set in. She had no one to blame but herself. Every smile in those vacation photos, every casual laugh with someone else had led to this moment. And now, faced with the tangible results of her choices, she had to confront them alone. Time passed in a strange, suspended way. She didn't leave the apartment. She didn't storm out or yell further. She just sat, absorbing the emptiness she had walked into, understanding that space wasn't just physical, it was a reflection of actions, decisions, and accountability. I remained beside her, silent, letting her process everything at her own pace. Eventually, she lifted her gaze, eyes meeting mine with a mixture of exhaustion, regret, and something that resembled understanding. She didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. The lesson had been delivered, clear and undeniable. Space had been given, boundaries had been respected, and consequences had manifested in ways she had never anticipated. I walked past her and sat quietly in the chair across the room, letting the silence hold its power. There was no triumph in this moment, no satisfaction born from malice. There was only clarity, a simple acknowledgement of cause and effect, choice and consequence. She had asked for space. She had received it. And in that space, she faced the truth of her actions, completely and unavoidably. Hours later, when she finally stood and left, the apartment remained unchanged, empty, precise, and deliberate. The absence of her car, the altered locks, the cleared parking space all remained as reminders that respect and compliance can be wielded with as much impact as any confrontation. She had demanded space. I had given it, and she had learned, in the starkest way possible, that space is not without its own form of power. In the end, I returned to the quiet of the apartment, sitting alone with the knowledge that boundaries had been enforced and lessons had been taught. It was not vengeance. It was the natural consequence of actions and words, a truth as immutable as the locks on the door, as absolute as the empty spaces she once claimed as hers. And in that quiet, I finally understood the depth of what had transpired, not just between us, but within the framework of respect, choice, and accountability.